Welcome back, my fellow Shield Brothers. It's the Shield Brother here for the History Armada, back again with episode 9 of History of the Germanic States. Today we're picking up right where we left off last time, in the mid-1930s, 1933 to be exact, with the rise of the Nazi regime in Germany. So at the end of the last episode, we saw the Weimar Republic, and before that, we saw the First World War and what its effects were on Europe. We saw the dissolving of the German Empire as well as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I mainly focused on Germany, but Austria also lost its connection with Hungary and a lot of its land. Austria is now no longer a great power and very small in stature. And we see that in just a second. The Nazi regime really restored economic prosperity and ended mass unemployment by spending a lot on the military and revamping production, while suppressing labor unions and strikes. The return of prosperity was what really gave the Nazi Party enormous popularity within Germany, with only minor, isolated, and subsequently unsuccessful cases of resistance within the German population over the 12 years of its rule. There was the Gestapo, or the secret police, under people such as Heinrich Himmler, who destroyed the political opposition to this Nazi party. And they also persecuted people such as gypsies and Jews, trying to force them into exile out of the German lands, while taking their property from them. And the party took control of the courts, local government, and all civil organizations, except the Protestant and Catholic churches. They left those alone. All expressions of public opinion were controlled by Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, who made effective use of film, mass rallies, and Hitler's hypnotic speaking to really win over the public. The Nazi salute idolized Hitler as its Führer, or leader, putting all powers into his hands. Nazi propaganda centered on Hitler himself and was quite effective in creating what historians called the Hitler myth. That Hitler was all-wise and never made any mistakes or failures by others would be corrected, and in fact, Hitler had very narrow range of interests and interactions, and he was very passive, simply assenting to pressures from whoever had his ear at the moment. So he never really made big decisions by himself. If his trusted advisor told him something on a certain issue, like, oh, there's a certain issue, we should do this, he would do what the advisor said. It wasn't really Hitler in charge of every aspect of this new Third Reich. And all top officials reported to Hitler and followed his basic policies, but they had considerable autonomy on a daily basis to do as they saw fit within this new Third Reich. So there's the establishment of the Nazi regime. In order to secure a majority of his Nazi party in the Reichstag, Hitler called for new elections. On the evening of the February 27th, 1933, the Reichstag building was set on fire. Hitler swiftly blamed all alleged communist uprisings, although there was none, and convinced President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag Fire Decree, which kind of redesigned most German civil liberties and brought them back, kind of cut back on the civil liberties and giving more power to the elected officials. And they also cut back on rights such as the freedom of assembly and the freedom of the press. That was no longer a thing under this new decree due to this fire. The decree allowed the police to detain people indefinitely without charges or a court order. 4,000 members of the Communist Party of Germany were arrested. Communist agitation was banned, but at this time, not the Communist Party itself, just their actions were banned. Communists and socialists were brought into hastily prepared Nazi concentration camps, such as Chemnitz concentration camp, where they were at the mercy of the Gestapo, the newly established secret police force. Communist Reichstag deputies were taken into protective custody to protect them from the Gestapo. So despite the terror and unprecedented propaganda, the last free German general elections on March 5th, 1933, while resulting in 43.9%, failed to give the majority of the powers to the NSDAP as Hitler had hoped. Together with the German National People's Party, however, he was able to form a slim majority government, and in March 1933, the Enabling Act, which was an amendment to the Weimar Constitution, passed in the Reichstag, by a vote of 444 to 94. So to obtain the 2/3 majority needed to pass the bill, accommodations were made with the Catholic Center Party, and the Nazis used the provisions of the Reichstag fire decree to keep several Social Democratic deputies from attending this vote. And the Communist deputies had already been banned from the Reichstag. So this amendment allowed Hitler and his cabinet to pass laws on their own, even laws that violated the Weimar Constitution that was in place, without the constitution of the President or the Reichstag Congress. The Enabling Act, it formed the basis for Hitler's dictatorship. It dissolved a lot of different trade unions and stuff, and these trade unions and political parties and other besides the Nazi Party were all suppressed. A centralized totalitarian state was established for Hitler. It was no longer based on the liberal Weimar Constitution, and Germany left the League of Nations. The coalition parliament was rigged by defining the absence of arrested and murdered deputies as voluntary, and therefore cause for their exclusion as willful absences, meaning that anyone that the Gestapo killed or captured was listed as willingly leaving, like they were said to have willingly left the Reichstag, where in reality they had either been detained or killed. And subsequently, in July, the Center Party was voluntarily dissolved with the Pope under the anti-communist Pope Pius XI for the Reichskorderat, and by these maneuvers, Hitler achieved movement of these Catholic voters into the Nazi Party, and a long-awaited international diplomatic acceptance of his regime was put in place. According to the Professor Dick Jerry, the Nazis gained a larger share of their vote in Protestant areas than in Catholic areas. In the elections held between 1928 and November 1932, the Communist Party was proscribed in April 1933. So after this, the Chief of Staff, Ernst Röhm, demanded more political and military power for him and his men, which caused anxiety among military, industrial, and political leaders at the time. In response, Adolf Hitler, under the SS and Gestapo to purge, he used and just really changed Germany in a dire way, and he used a newly formed SS and the Gestapo to purge the entire SA leadership, along with a number of Hitler's political adversaries. And it became known as the Night of the Long Knives because they just killed anyone who was seen as any kind of threat or nuisance to Hitler's new regime, using this newly formed SS and Gestapo to rid them of the old SA. So upon Hindenburg's death on August 2nd, 1934, Hitler's cabinet passed a law proclaiming the presidency to be vacant and transferred the role and powers of the head of state to Hitler as Chancellor and Führer. So, anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Obviously, if we're going to talk about Nazi Germany, we have to talk about the evil deeds done. The Nazi regime was particularly hostile towards Jews and Gypsies, Jews being the main enemy in propaganda means and just in their attacks, who became the target of unending anti-Semitic propaganda attacks. The Nazis attempted to convince the German peoples to view and treat Jews as subhuman, and immediately after winning almost 44% of the parliamentary seats in the 1933 federal election, the Nazi Party imposed a nationwide boycott on Jewish businesses. In March 1933, the first official Nazi concentration camp was established at Dachau in Bavaria. And from 1933 to 1935, the Nazi regime consolidated their power within this new German totalitarian dictatorship. The law of the restoration of the professional civil service passed on April 7th, 1933, which forced all Jewish civil servants to retire from their legal professions and civil services. In the Nuremberg laws of 1935, it banned sexual relations between Jews and Germans, and only those of German or related Germanic blood were eligible to be considered citizens of this new German Reich. The remainder were classed as state subjects without citizen rights. They were no longer given citizenship, they were just seen as subjects of the state. This stripped Jews, and Romas and others of their legal rights. Jews continued to suffer persecution under the Nazi regime, exemplified by the Kristallnacht program of 1938. About half of Germany's 500,000 Jews fled the country before 1939, after which escape became almost impossible to do so. In 1941, the Nazi leadership decided to implement a plan called the Final Solution, which came to be known as the Holocaust. Under this plan, the Jews and other lesser races, along with many political opponents from Germany as well as occupied countries, were systematically murdered at murder sites in Nazi concentration camps starting in 1942 at extermination camps. Between 1941 and 1945, Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, Communists, homosexuals, and those considered mentally or physically disabled or handicapped, and members of opposing political parties were targeted and methodically murdered and removed from the German Reich. The origin of the word genocide became during this time. In total, approximately 11 million people were killed during the Holocaust, including 1.1 million children, due to just these different tactics used by Hitler and his regime. So let's talk about what role the women had under this new Nazi regime in Germany. Historians, having paid special attention to the efforts by Nazi Germany to reverse the gains women made before 1933, especially in the relatively liberal Weimar Republic, it appears that the role of women in Nazi Germany changed according to whatever circumstances they were under. Theoretically, the Nazis advocated a patriarchal society in which German women were recognized that her world is her husband, her family, her children, and her home. That's a quote. And she was supposed to just stay at home, be the good, mother and housewife. However, before 1933, women played important roles in the Nazi organization and were allowed some autonomy to mobilize other women. After Hitler came to power in 1933, feminist groups were shut down or incorporated into the National Socialist Women's League, which coordinated groups throughout the country to promote feminine virtues, motherhood, and household activities to be their main goal. Courses were offered on childbearing, sewing, and cooking. The Nazi regime did promote a liberal code of conduct regarding heterosexual relations among the Germans, and was sympathetic to women who bore children out of wedlock. The Lebensborn, or the Fountain of Life Association, founded by Heinrich Himmler in 1935, created a series of maternity homes where the single mothers could find refuge and could be accommodated during their pregnancies, which is really groundbreaking, especially under such a totalitarian role. And as Germany prepared for war, large numbers of women were incorporated into the public sector with the need for full mobilization of factories by 1943. All women under the age of 50 were required to register with the Employment Office for work assignments to help with the war effort. Women's wages remained unequal to men, and women were denied positions of leadership or control within the factories and other political or public standing. In 1944 to 1945, more than 500,000 women would volunteer and into uniformed auxiliary units in the German Armed Forces, or the Wehrmacht. About the same number served in the civil aerial defense. 400,000 defense women volunteered as nurses, and many more would replace drafted men in the wartime economy. In the Luftwaffe, or the Air Force, they served in auxiliary roles by helping to operate the anti-aircraft systems that shot down Allied bombers. So, not only were women given, groundbreaking help during their pregnancies outside of wedlock, they were also used in the economic standards, the industrial places, as well as the armed forces and the Air Force. So speaking of the armed forces and the Air Force, we have to talk about Nazi Germany military. So in 1935, Hitler officially re-established the Luftwaffe, which is the Air Force, and reintroduced universal military service. This was a breach in the Treaty of Versailles, as we spoke about in the earlier episodes. Britain, France, and Italy issued notes of protest about this. Hitler had the officers swear their personal allegiance to him himself, not to Germany, but to him. In 1936, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland, and as the territory was part of Germany, the British and French governments did not feel that attempting to enforce the treaty was worth the risk of war. So they just kind of let him walk on into the Rhineland. The move strengthened Hitler's standing in Germany. His reputation swelled further with the 1936 Summer Olympics, which were held in the same year in Berlin, and proved another great propaganda success for the regime as orchestrated by master propagandist Joseph Goebbels. And their military really was something of awe, with especially their armed forces and their armored mobile vehicles such as the Panzers, which really were quite impressive for just having to completely remilitarize after being forced to demilitarize after the Treaty of Versailles. So what was their foreign policy like? Well, Hitler's diplomatic strategy in the 1930s was to make seemingly reasonable demands, threatening war if they were not met. When opponents tried to appease him, he accepted the gains that were offered, then went on to the next target. And he did this with Yugoslavia, when he took their land. He did this with the Rhineland. He just did this several times. When opponents tried to appease him, he would just kind of accept what they would give him after forcing his way in. So the aggressive strategy worked as Germany pulled out of the League of Nations, rejected the Versailles Treaty, and began to rearm. Won back the Tsar and remilitarized the Rhineland, formed an alliance with Mussolini's Italy, forming the Axis powers, and sent massive military aid to Franco in the Spanish Civil War. He also annexed Austria. I talked about that earlier. Austria was weakened. They also had a fascist leader kind of rise to power, and with him in the chair of power, Hitler would annex Austria. And so after that, he took over Czechoslovakia after the British and French appeasement of the Munich Agreement of 1938. And he formed a Czechoslovakia peace pact, and he also formed a peace pact with Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union in August of 1939. And finally, he invaded and partitioned Poland with the Soviet Union on September 1st, 1939. Britain and France drew the line there and declared war on Germany 2 days later, and World War II erupted in Europe. After establishing the Rome-Berlin axis with Benito Mussolini, he signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan, which was joined by Italy in a year later in 1937. Hitler felt able to take the offensive in foreign policy. On March 12, 1938, Germany would send troops who marched into Austria, where an attempted Nazi coup had been unsuccessful in 1934. When Austria-born Hitler entered Vienna, he was greeted by loud cheers and a large celebration. 4 weeks later, 99% of Austrians voted in favor of the annexation or the Anschluss of their country, Austria, into the German Reich. After Austria, Hitler turned to Czechoslovakia, where the 3.5 million strong Sudetenland had German citizens who demanded equal rights and self-government. At the Munich Conference in September of 1938, Hitler and the Italian leader Benito Mussolini met with the British Prime Minister at the time, Neville Chamberlain, and the French Prime Minister, Edouard Daladier, and agreed upon the secession of the Sudetenland into the territory of the Germanic Right by Czechoslovakia. And then after that, it just really boosted his esteem, and however, after 6 months after the Munich Agreement, in March of 1939, Hitler used the smoldering quarrel between the Slovaks and the Czechs as a pretext for taking over the rest of Czechoslovakia. And he also, as the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, he took those lands. In the same month, he secured the return of Melfom from Lithuania to Germany, and Chamberlain was forced to acknowledge that his policy of appeasement towards Hitler had failed. So, using this forceful foreign policy, he regained all of the territory that they had lost to the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. And so the French and the English and the other powers in Europe had been using this tactic of appeasement to just kind of give him what he wants and hope he stops there. But after he takes back all of his land and remilitarizes, people such as Chamberlain were forced to realize that the appeasement tactic was failing and would not work against Adolf Hitler. So that brings us to World War II. So I'm not going to cover all of the World War II tactics and battles and etc. because that would just be a lot of information for this one video. Instead, let's just talk about very basic stuff with Germany and the German Reich within World War II. So at first, Germany was very successful in its military operations, including the invasions of Poland, Norway, and the Low Countries, and France in 1940, creating Vichy France in its stead. The unexpectedly swift defeat of France resulted in an upswing in Hitler's popularity and an upsurgence of war fever within the German Reich. Hitler made peace overtures to the new British leader Winston Churchill in July of 1940. But Churchill remained dogged in his defiance. Churchill had major financial, military, and diplomatic help from the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And in the US, Hitler's emphasis on maintaining a higher living standard postponed the full mobilization of the national economy until 1942. Germany's armed forces invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, weeks behind schedule due to the invasion of Yugoslavia, but swept forward until they reached the gates of Moscow. And the tide began to turn in December 1941 when the invasion of the Soviet Union hit very determined resistance at the Battle of Moscow, and Hitler declared war on the United States to back up the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. After surrendering in North Africa and losing the Battle of Stalingrad to the Soviet Union, the Germans were forced into the defensive. By late 1944, the United States, Canada, France, Great Britain, and their smaller allies were all closing in on Germany in the West, while the Soviets were viciously and victoriously advancing in the East. So this two-front war would ultimately be Hitler's downfall, as well as the signing of declaration of war on the U.S. Those are the two things that if you ever are wondering what really caused Hitler's downfall, it's the two-front war between the Allies and the Soviet Union, as well as the signing of war against the United States to back up Japan. And with them closing in on either side, there is an estimated amount of about 353,000 civilians who were killed by British and American strategic bombing of German cities and industrial sites, and 9 million were left homeless due to this. Nazi Germany collapsed as Berlin was taken by the Red Army, and in a fight to the death in the city streets, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, and the final German instrument of surrender was signed on May 8th, 1945. So, about 6 years later, Germany has capitulated and the Third Reich has fallen. By September 1945, Nazi Germany and its Axis partners, Italy and Japan, had all been defeated, chiefly by the forces of the Soviet Union and the United States, as well as the Great Britain. Much of Europe lay in ruins. Over 60 million people worldwide had been killed, most of them civilians, including approximately 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews, that became known as the Holocaust. World War II resulted in the destruction of Germany's political and economic infrastructure and led directly to its partition, considerable loss of territory, and historical legacy of guilt and shame due to the just corruptness and evil regime under Adolf Hitler. So this is the layout you can look on your left, and this is what the pretense to World War II looked like. The dark blue is the German lands, and then the lighter blues are its allies or its held lands that had been annexed or occupied. And then on its east, you can see the Soviet Union, and in the green, you can see the allies. And this is what the map looks like leading up to World War II. And World War II was really just... Yes, World War I was the first really world war, and, other wars before that had encompassed tons of different countries, but World War II was just really devastating on a massive scale, especially within these smaller European countries. And we see, once again, the downfall of these Germanic states with the disintegration of the German Third Reich, and as well as, again, the stomping of the Austrian lands. So, if you turn in next week, we're going to talk about the partition of Germany and what Germany and Austria and its Germanic states were like during the Cold War. And I believe that will be our last episode, so tune in next week for that. And on your map left, you can see how Germany was partitioned between Poland, the Soviet Union, America, France, and Britain, and Berlin being split between the Allies, the Soviet Union, having East and West Berlin. And we'll talk about that next week with its Cold War status. And thank you so much for tuning in. This has been the Shield Brother with the History Armada. If you like this content, go ahead and leave me a like. If you don't, leave me a dislike. And if you have a comment, question, or concern, leave that down below and let me see it. And as always, I'll catch y'all next time.